Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss Britain arresting a comedian, Google finding out that it won't have to sell off its search engine, and ask whether the AI bubble is bursting. I'm joined by Frawley and Geoff Shullenberger, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. So, Ashley, you wrote for Compact this week on Britain's arrest of the comedian Graham Linehan. Your article, The Public Health Model of Speech Suppression, offers really the deepest analysis of this I've seen. You describe a particular kind of oppressive regime we're seeing emerge where it's not just, kind of tough law and order government where, vice is punished and malfeasance meets its just reward. It's rather this regime focused on prevention or kind of stopping the spread, kind of quarantining bad ideas and locking down those who might spread them. So it's somehow criminal justice system borrowing its way of viewing the world from public health. How do you see that operating in the Linehan case?
First off, I should say that I was actually really shocked to see this news break yesterday morning, which was the 2nd of September, when I read his blog post describing did we still say that? Substack, describing what had happened. And, I guess maybe it's like I live in a social media bubble, but it seemed to me that these things were so passé. And this idea that you're going to have the cops show up over a mean tweet, it just seems so 2020, but it just really goes to show how deeply embedded into our institutions this is and how much it is part of, as I say in the article, this overarching governing ideology. So in this case, a lot of people in their analyses, obviously this is a big moment in the culture war, and anybody who's been specializing and commenting on the culture wars is commenting on this story. And it's just, everybody's pointing out the hypocrisy, right? Though it's a two-tier here, it's a two-tier legal system. You got one law for one group and one law for the other. And it's just like, that's it. Well, why? Why does that make sense? What's the logic behind that? And you have to understand that in the minds of the state, in the minds of institutions, the professional class, this makes perfect sense. Because what has happened is there's been this huge shift wherein a whole range of institutions operate on the basis of what is essentially an ideology that comes from public health, which is that prevention is better than cure. And if you listen to any NGO, any kind of social movement, what they become now, these sort of lobby groups, they will say, we need to prevent this before it happens. And it sounds good, right? That's how you're going to save money and save the world. You're going to prevent these things before they happen. But when that ideology moves into almost every aspect of everyday life and into every institution, then you start to see that freedom, even the most kind of basic freedoms, become liabilities. They become risks. They become things that they're variables that are very, very hard to control. And speech is one of these things. And it becomes, in some ways, the ideal thing for the police to focus on. Because once you've already committed a crime, from this perspective, prevention is better than cure, the institution of policing and criminal justice has already failed. It's already failed. Because the crime has been committed. And that's why you see pedophiles and rapists getting put up for early release. And everyone's like, what? I was like, well, no, because prevention is better than cure. It's too late for these people. And anyway, we've got these psychological things and interventions and so on that will keep them on the right path, which it won't, by the way. It doesn't work. But they say that. And so we're going to prevent the next crime for these people, right? So punishment becomes something that doesn't even really matter. It's too late for that. We got to do it. We got to uphold a certain image here. But it becomes something that it becomes demoted. So speech becomes the ideal crime, the perfect crime, not in the sense that people understand the perfect crime is like, I'll never get caught. It's the perfect crime from the perspective of the police because they can intervene and stop violence, stop bad things before they even start. Because obviously, from their perspective, what is crime? What is violence if not a bad thought? If not an emotion that has not been correctly controlled. So if they can intervene at the first symptom of these bad thoughts, which is speech, then they can prevent future things from happening. So the focus of policing shifts from curative medicine, would be the metaphor, from criminality toward normal society, just as public health has shifted from treatment of the sick to regulation of the well. So the police become focused and tasked with regulation of normal society. And everyone is sort of dumbfounded by that. Like, why are you coming to me? Why do you come down harder on me? I'm just an ordinary citizen who's just got mad and said something stupid online. And there was a few weeks ago, it was a week and a half ago, a migrant walked into a woman's house. And this guy, there's a picture of him. He looked like the Southport killer. It was some scary stuff. And the woman's screaming. He manages to get this man out of her house. Police are standing there. No, we can't do anything about that. We can't do anything about that. No, and in fact, the woman was arrested. What? Because she was becoming troublesome. Why? Because she's part of normal society. These people are already outside it. We can't do much for them. These people are part of normal society. You are the focus. You are the one who's going to get arrested. So that is the kind of logic that's at play here, and what makes it make perfect sense that Linehan gets arrested while petty theft is basically decriminalized. Now, people have been up in arms about that, and so they're starting to kind of crack down a little more. But essentially, for a long time, and in London, if there's an epidemic, just your phone just gets snatched off you, and there's just nothing you can do about it. But you're gonna have 5 police officers meet this comedian as he gets off a plane like he's a drug trafficker or a terrorist or something. Well, that's how it works. And then the other thing that's very interesting about this story, if you forgive me going on, was Linehan's tweet was almost exactly the same as the punch a turf thing, which is it's so common to say. I think they even were putting that on T-shirts. And I think there was probably one show arrest of someone who literally screamed punch a turf at a protest. But generally, you can go on Twitter every day. I see stuff on Twitter about Jews and punching turfs. You just say whatever you want. And nothing happens. Why? Why is punch a turf almost the exact same thing? Well, I didn't say, but what happened was one of the tweets, and this is why there's some semblance of defensibility on the part of the police for why they arrested him, was that he said, what trans-identified men in women's spaces are doing is an act of violence. They are being violent against you. He comes from a leftist background, so we can forgive him for that overstatement. Everything is violent. So he says you should respond to it with violence. You should defend your spaces, call the police, do what you can. Failing that, and he jokes, punch him in the balls. That's what he said. And okay, so that could be incitement, was the idea. But people can say punch a turf all they want. Well, why? And I don't know if I should spoil it. Maybe we should just send readers on back to read the full article. But it's because these people are aligned with institutions. They are the extension of the police. They are doing the bidding of institutions by saying, you don't belong in society. I am in society. I am part of this regulatory apparatus, not against it. So I'm more or less going to do what I want because I'm trying to ensure a healthy society. And I've given you these words and phrases that you're supposed to say, these mantras, and you should show adequate deference, just like the religion of public health tells you to go to the gym and watch your calories and recite a few lines every now and then to make sure that you keep the body healthy. Well, you're supposed to recite these lines to ensure your mind is healthy. Trans women are women. You just repeat it and it's good. It's good for your soul. It's like it's like a prayer, and it's it makes you healthy. It's like eating broccoli a little bit. And these people are not doing that. It's such a simple thing. Why can't you just do it? Why can't you just be nice? Why can't you just say this thing and society will be harmonious and it'll be inclusive and everything will be fine? Why can't you just do that? And so their anger is righteous anger, and it's institutionally aligned and state aligned anger, and it is sanctioned from above because it is in the name of that ideology and in the name of public health as governance, keeping that social body healthy. That's what they feel that they're tasked with, these activists. And so therefore they can say punch a turf. It doesn't matter. They can do what they want, essentially, because they're aligned with the state.
One thing that's been interesting to see is that British leaders of the left Liberal Labour Party don't want to defend this action. They seem to be doing their best to back away from it. Keir Starmer, Prime Minister of Britain, said the police must, quote, focus on the most serious issues, unquote, when asked about the arrest. That obviously isn't a direct disavowal and leaves him with plenty of room to maneuver, but he seems to sense that the wind is blowing heavily against these kinds of restrictions. The Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, similarly said that the government needed to, quote, look at the relevant legislation following the arrest. So it's interesting. Do you have a sense, Ashley, that there might be some real movement on these things, given the fact that we have not just Nigel Farage going after them and the Conservative leader Kemi Badenoch, but actually Labour leaders saying, yeah, we may have taken a step too far here.
Yeah, that's partially why it was so shocking that so many people are walking it back, and the cowards and the liars are coming out saying, I was a coward and a liar. People are just outright saying that, about men and women's sports and this kind of thing. They
Are you talking about Malcolm Gladwell's
yes.
comment, the New Yorker writer Malcolm Gladwell?
And create any
name the
enemies.
cowards. As long, what did he say?
That's exactly. Yeah, he said that he was bullied. And that he was afraid, and that's why he said that. And okay, to a certain extent,
why he said basically that men should be, biological men or trans women as they're called, should be allowed in female-only spaces like women's athletic competition.
Yeah, and so he took back things that he had said earlier on the basis that he had been bullied into it. And to a certain extent, I do understand that. You got a family to feed, this sort of thing. It was crazy. I called it in the article, I called it a muzzle, and that's what it felt like. I never actually said anything for probably a good, after it started really heating up, I probably didn't speak out initially, partially because I had, I don't say probably, I definitely didn't speak out initially because I had trans students, and it wasn't their fault, that they had been brought into this kind of ideology and told that this was a solution to all their problems. And it was an awkward thing for me to do. I cared a lot about my students. And I probably wouldn't have lost my job. It probably would have been good for me, actually. I remember standing in line at a conference once, and this guy goes, Nick, what you really need to do is get canceled. At the time, it was like, if you were kind of an up and coming kind of political commentator, the best thing you could do was get canceled. And I got canceled for all sorts of stupid things at the time. So it probably would have been great for me to have spoken up at that time. But I didn't, because I didn't want to stand up in front of my students and hurt them and have to answer to them. And maybe I should have. I don't know. Maybe that was really cowardly of me. I'm not sure. But I still think about one particular student who I love dearly, who's trans. Still think about this person all the time, and whether or not she reads my stuff and if I've hurt her. So, it was quite personal for me. So I do understand some of the reluctance. But at this point, it is not at all risky to come out, and people are coming out, and the tide has turned completely. Starmer has started saying, it was a big issue in the last election. Could you say that that trans women are not actually women? And I was like, yes, I will say this. So that's why it was so shocking that this happened, because it appeared that the state's line on this had entirely shifted. So I'm of two minds about this. One, and I think he alludes to this in the Substack post, that he thinks it might have been a particular trans activist with some kind of connection to the police, and therefore a more direct connection to actually getting something done. Or what I think is possibly the case, that this stuff is so embedded in institutions that it doesn't really matter what political postures people like Keir Starmer are making, when this is how the institution itself functions. And I almost wrote like the most boring analysis of this, because this is what happens when you have a fad. You create all these spaces and institutions where people are trained. This is their job. It's their job to push this junk. It's, and it happens in therapeutic politics as well, and like well-being agenda and mindfulness. You get all these people who are trained in mindfulness, and if it gets proven to be harmful or ineffective, they are invested in it and they're looking for the next thing. So if it's not this, it's going to be something else. So it's hard to kind of root these things out because it's you've created institutional spaces and people who are dependent on it. But also, it is, as I said, part of this broader governance strategy. So you're just going to see something else come up. So I think it's going to take time for this stuff to make its way out of institutions if the tide indeed has turned. But we should also be vigilant because something else is going to take its place, because you have all these people whose job it is to push something like this, to create the training, to promise to solve the problems, to promise to prevent the next crime. That's what's going to happen here. And it's not going to be trans ideology. It's just going to be something else.
Yeah, it's really striking to watch this play out. I mean, certainly in terms of the institutional logic here in American law in various ways, and this is very true in New York City, where I am. There are lots of laws on the books about trans rights, using preferred pronouns and things. And if you don't respect the law and you're operating a business, you can be subject to very serious legal scrutiny. So, that remains on the books. And then in terms of the fact that we're seeing a shift against some of these progressive pieties, but as you say, Ashley, we don't necessarily seem to be seeing an emergence of freedom. I think we already see how that dynamic is playing out. I was very struck by a piece that Compact editor-at-large Greg Conti wrote for the Chronicle of Higher Education, and he was writing about what's been going on at universities since the Trump administration came into office, and there's been a backlash against some of the kind of left liberal speech restrictions and the kind of anti-Israel and at times seemingly anti-Semitic rhetoric on campus. And he talked about attending an event where he wanted to ask a question of the speaker, and normally, a student or someone would bring a microphone to you and hand you the microphone. You'd ask the question, then hand it back. But in this case, it turned out, and this is a new policy, the student has to always hold the microphone. And that's basically Princeton trying to prevent one of these scenes where student activists are holding a microphone and shouting at a speaker and effectively taking control of the event. But it means that a Princeton professor is being treated like a peon by his own institution, which is a very bizarre thing. And then he spoke about another event where there was a kind of disruption occurring, and the speaker, who was a professor, was told, no, you should not intervene and tell the students to be silent. We're sending for a kind of student speech, we're sending for a free speech facilitator from the other side of campus who will come here and facilitate free speech by intervening. So you can't actually run this event through reassertion of the traditional lines of authority in a university setting. No, free speech must be facilitated, must be managed by the managers, by the facilitators who are supposed to be doing this. And then, of course, we've seen this emerge really, really clearly just in the Trump administration's move against the universities. Christopher Caldwell wrote for us on this earlier this year, and his essay took a dim view, really, of what's going on, because his own understanding of civil rights law is that it tends to suppress free speech and free association, things that his writing suggests are very much worth valuing. And that's true whether you're wielding these laws in the name of trans rights or wielding them in the name of combating anti-Semitism. So the Trump administration has made certain moves against civil rights laws. It's revoked the executive order that mandated affirmative action for government contractors, for example. But in other places, especially in its attempt to reorient the universities, it has doubled down on civil rights law as a tool of shaping the behavior of ostensibly private actors. And Chris Rufo has written about this as well. He's very supportive of what the administration is doing. He concedes much of what Caldwell says, but thinks that wielding the civil rights law is necessary for restoring a kind of equilibrium. So, actors on political actors like Chris Rufo and analysts like Christopher Caldwell, I think, are very aware of these dynamics and have sometimes have diverging understandings of what course should be pursued. But from where I sit, it doesn't seem that we're really moving away from these forms of speech management and regulation. We're at best redirecting them.
It does seem worth noting, maybe the obvious, which is that this does seem, I imagine there are versions of this story we could find in other parts of Europe. It does seem specifically British in some respects. There aren't incidents of this sort that I'm aware of occurring in the US, particularly with this particular flavor of politics. I would point people back to a piece by Dan Hitchens that we published in 2023 called "The Thing That Swallowed Britain," which is a useful explanation of the kind of specific context in which Hitchens believes, various institutions, including the police, have sort of gone in this direction of kind of bureaucratizing and managerial excess, which has also involved a gradual capture by various kinds of activist interests. I think Hitchens does a nice job of explaining pretty efficiently kind of where this came from and how it happened, partly coming out of a crisis of purpose, of institutional purpose for various of these, kind of old and venerable British institutions that, due to various kinds of initiatives, found themselves forced to redefine themselves, to sort of professionalize themselves as the government demanded they do, which meant installing all kinds of procedures and checks and removing autonomy from individual police officers, precincts, or whatever you call them in Britain, and so on, and placing them under this common bureaucratic logic, which then for various reasons was set up in such a way that certain activist interests could capture it. And my understanding of policing in the US is that this hasn't quite happened in this way. But anyway, I think this is a worthwhile piece from, again, 2023 to revisit by Dan Hitchens, the Thing That Swallowed Britain. I'll just say personally, I can only see this as just such a kind of comedy sketch, in part because I was so steeped in Monty Python growing up, and of course the British sort of policeman is a constant figure of comedy in that context, in a way that isn't quite the case in American culture. This sort of what's all this then kind of figure who's kind of bumbling and intrusive, but ultimately kind of benign. And I will say, just as an anecdotal aside, that in my several years living in Britain, I did have a couple of encounters with the police, which I won't give the reasons for.
Oh, go on.
I mean, nothing too serious, but I found it interesting how awkward these encounters were. They seem very awkward for when I've had run-ins with cops in the US, the cops tend to be domineering, aggressive, and varyingly unpleasant. In this case, the cops seemed very uncomfortable with having to, tell me I was breaking rules or whatever I happened to be doing. And I always found that kind of interesting, that the awkwardness of this encounter. It did kind of, and so it did seem to me there was kind of this different culture of policing. And this is 20 years ago. that, had this kind of greater kind of sense of politeness around it. And I do wonder whether, just that the police officer, I mean, I'll give one example. I was driving a car. So essentially the kind of registration sticker in the window was, it was a very messy car. And the registration sticker in the window was kind of, had fallen off. And so you couldn't see it, like the glue had come off, and so you couldn't see it. And so the policeman, was pestering me to show him the registration sticker, but he was extremely apologetic about asking for this and seemed kind of, he seemed to think it was unfortunate that he had to disturb me. So anyway, I think there's something kind of interesting in that maybe here as well, this kind of sense of, that on one hand, there's this kind of bureaucratic logic, but then I wonder if there's also this kind of cultural logic, which is the logic of kind of trying to maintain a certain kind of politeness and civility, which might seem, you can imagine a very benign and unthreatening version of it, but it's interesting how it can kind of twist into this dystopian Kafkaesque version in which the enforcement of politeness and civility becomes this kind of, extremely pervasive logic of control and suppression and sort of prophylaxis, as Ashley described it. So I guess, the thing that strikes me about this is that there's a version of the British police officer that I have in my head that's very kind of benign and jovial and almost painfully polite. And then it seems like almost this is an instance in which this twists into something really, it's a kind of perfect horror movie almost, where, the seemingly benign thing kind of twists into something quite malign and even terrifying.
Well, you have to understand that British politeness is also malign and terrifying. And it took me a long time to realize. I was like, everyone is so nice. And I did not realize they were not actually nice. But you mentioned something that was really important. You said that things don't manifest the same way in the United States. I think they actually do, but they can't go to the extent. So this whole thing that I'm talking about, what's happened to institutions, is essentially the regulatory state. There's a lot of literature describing this, the rise of the regulatory state and regulatory capitalism. And this is what empties out all of these institutions and turns them into glorified regulatory bodies. So ideally, public health is just a regulatory body. It's just going to tell you how to live, and you should just go to it for advice. And then, maybe they'll kill you at the end, and that's it. Like, it's going to give you an injection. It's too costly to be treating all this ill health, right? And it's the same thing for criminality. It's just too costly to be dealing with all this criminality. So ideally, we just dispense advice, and that's why the police will come to your door and check your thinking, this sort of thing. Now, that doesn't happen in the United States because you've got the First Amendment, thank God. But the activists who found their way into institutions, as they became these regulatory bodies, all these people who, and they were very open to these activists who came in and were like, I will whitewash, I will give your regulations, your neoliberalism, a kind of leftish wash so that it's for your own good. And I'm going to come up with all these rules with therapeutic justifications and all these things that you're supposed to do and all these checklists. And I'm going to make it sound real nice for you. And that's how they managed to get into these institutions. But they could never go so far as to actually controlling how people spoke because of, as I said, the First Amendment. But a lot of this stuff that I've been studying for years comes from the United States. Like, wokeness came from the United States, the desperate desire to, freeze speech, the desperate desire to shut down public debate, etc. They couldn't make headway there, but they could make headway in the UK. A lot of because there's a faster kind of track into actually institutionalizing things because of devolution, things like that. So they will go to Wales. A lot of this stuff, it's not even just, free speech. It's things like regulation of family life and that sort of thing. They go to Wales, they go to New Zealand, they go to Australia, they go to Scotland. It's a very common kind of thing. All these NGOs and these groups, they want all this stuff in the United States, but they can't have it because there's at least a modicum of respect for freedom. But I was just looking at some of the discussion around this article that we just published of mine from Compact, and it was some sort of post-liberals who were saying, this is a good article, it's a good analysis, but I smell it's coming from a liberal perspective. It's not really, but why did they have a problem with it? Because how can you? They believe in this idea of regulation and of public health and prevention is better than cure, and how do they stop it from rolling over into the destruction of freedom? They can't. And this is the problem that we have now, where our culture, whether or not people believe in it or call it post-liberalism or give it a philosophy, a conscious philosophy, our culture and our society and our governing institutions, they're all post-liberal. They deeply regret liberalism, deeply regret the Enlightenment and so on. And we are America is emptying out institutions the exact same way and changing them into regulatory bodies. Oh, business should run the state. Okay, what does the state do? The state's going to write rules for you. That's the regulatory state. You've got the same problems in the United States. They're just masked. It's coming for you too, is what I'm trying to say.
I'll make a transition here to a development that I think can be connected to what you're describing, and that's the decision by a judge in Google's antitrust case to say that Google doesn't need to sell off its web browser, Chrome. The details of antitrust cases are maybe not the most exciting podcast fodder, but long story short, this is a development that's quite disappointing for advocates of antitrust. And antitrust draws its moral appeal, its political appeal from the idea that society shouldn't be dominated by any one power, by any one company, that having various companies checking each other is the way to allow for some space for freedom. And that's it's certainly a strong part of this idea is a strong part of the American pursuit of freedom in the Jeffersonian, Jacksonian vein, the desire to break up large concentrations of power. So the fact that Google is getting what looks like a slap on the wrist would seem to be maybe another sign that the kind of recent realignment, the upsurge in sentiment around the importance of workers' rights, of checking corporate power in various ways, and I think you can see that upsurge is maybe beginning with the 2008 financial crisis and Occupy Wall Street and extending through in various ways the Trump and the Sanders campaigns, the Linehan regime and the Biden administration with antitrust, and expressed still in the new Trump administration and figures like Gail Slater, Trump's antitrust point woman. There's been an attempt to revive this tradition, but it doesn't really seem to be going so far. So maybe we're doomed. We're doomed to be under corporate control. Obviously, there are criticisms of antitrust as an approach to political economy, this Jeffersonian, Jacksonian tradition. There's our own contributor, Michael Lind, advocates for a different position, saying, look, really, you can't check corporate power by having various corporations compete against each other. You need the countervailing power, right, of unions. And you shouldn't fear big corporations. You should just make sure that they're checked by other large institutions in society of different kinds. I think that's a very legitimate perspective. But the Google ruling, I think, does show that one very popular and long-standing account of how American freedom can be achieved is not carrying the day.
I happen to have been reading a lot of things about the early internet and the advocacy carried out by groups like the Electronic Freedom Foundation.
And why have you been reading these things, Geoff?
Because I am writing a book that touches on all of this. So
place your pre-orders now.
Yes, watch this space. But I have been reading a lot of the literature coming out of this realm of early internet advocacy. and, specifically organizations like the Electronic Freedom Foundation, publications like Wired Magazine. And these entities, what's fascinating about them is that they all lay claim to this Jeffersonian, Jacksonian tradition. In fact, one of the most famous, or really the two most famous manifestos of sort of internet enthusiasts and, digital rights activists of the 1990s, one is called the Magna Carta for the Knowledge Age. One is called the Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace, probably somewhat better remembered by John Perry Barlow, who was both the Grateful Dead lyricist and volunteer on Dick Cheney's congressional campaign. So a perfect embodiment of the so-called Californian ideology. So Barlow, explicitly invokes Jefferson in his Declaration of Independence. But what's fascinating about this in terms of the current the recent Google decision and the current exercise of monopoly power online is that these ideologues who kind of developed the early notion of internet freedom, first of all, have an extremely vague, compared to the Jeffersonian Jacksonian tradition, which is rooted in this notion of the yeoman farmer, of small holdings, as opposed to, big land monopolists who, from that perspective, were seeking to kind of recreate a sort of quasi-feudal aristocracy in the United States. And so, what was needed to fight against that and the ideal citizen of American democracy was the smallholder, the yeoman farmer. And of course, a great deal of legislation over the course of U.S. history has attempted to kind of realize this ideal. The Homestead Act, really the aspects of the GI Bill that, made home ownership a sort of key dimension of middle class prosperity in the mid 20th century. All of these were attempts to realize this ideal of the democratic citizen as a small property holder. But the interesting thing about these advocates of internet freedom, who again invoked Jefferson and Jackson and this whole tradition, is that they, Barlow, in fact, in the Declaration of Independence, claims that property has no relevance as a category in digital spaces. That there is simply no category of property that makes sense. There are other writings where he kind of develops his ideas about property more. But, essentially, he thinks that because the digital realm is not a material realm, the whole notion of material property in the sense of small holdings versus large land holdings is moot. And similarly, Magna Carta, which I mentioned before, written by George Gilder, Alvin Toffler, and Esther Dyson, who were a mix of, sort of Republican-leaning political ideologues and operatives, and in the case of Dyson, a kind of early, internet enthusiast and sort of Wired magazine, promoter of new technologies. So, what they do is say the internet must be a realm of, again, they sort of elide or kind of attempt to avoid any detailed consideration of the question of property. But essentially what they argue is that the internet must not belong to the state. It must belong to citizens, as they call it. But what citizens really turns out to mean is, in the context of the mid-90s, the large telecom, the government essentially hands over control of the backbone of the internet, which was run through the National Science Foundation, to Pacific Bell, AT&T, these kind of large telecom companies in 1995. And then the Telecommunications Act, passed by the Republican Congress and signed into law by Bill Clinton in early 1996, is, also has this kind of deregulatory effect. And the way that this is justified is, again, in Jacksonian, Jeffersonian terms. This is about handing over the internet to the people. But in sort of property terms, what this ends up really meaning is handing it over to a handful of large telecommunications corporations, as well as the various other corporate interests that during the dot-com boom of the late 90s, kind of engage in a speculative kind of land acquisition frenzy, buying up URLs, right, which is part of the meaning of the dot-com boom, and it becomes an opportunity for investing in these domain names and then flipping them. And so, this whole question of property and of what it means for the people to own the digital realm is completely swept under the rug by this worldview, because in this account, for Google, or for some which didn't exist yet at that point, but for a handful of large corporations to essentially own in every meaningful sense this world is by this account simply a version of the people owning it, because for the people to own it from this account just simply means for the government not to own it. So it's an extremely bizarre worldview in a way, because it lays claim to this Jeffersonian, Jacksonian tradition, but at the same time, it's completely comfortable with vast monopoly power. And the same people who I mentioned in the Microsoft antitrust case, which is really where a lot of these issues come to a head in the legal context in the late 90s, all of these people think the state is essentially persecuting Bill Gates and Microsoft, and that he is simply an entrepreneur who's making good. And so they don't they simply don't draw this distinction between the people in the sense of some kind of quasi Jeffersonian yeoman figure online, and large landowners, large monopoly power. And I think we're still haunted by the fact that the whole way that this politics was articulated and really was embraced on a bipartisan basis by both the Republican Congress under Newt Gingrich and by the White House under Bill Clinton and Al Gore, especially Al Gore, who in 1997 published a document that essentially accepted most of these principles from the Magna Carta, which was, again, a kind of Republican-affiliated document, which made this position that the internet must be a realm of the private sphere. It must not be a public or publicly controlled realm, even though, of course, it was built as a state project. And the whole question of what the private sphere is glossed over. It's implied to be the citizenry, but in fact, what it ends up being is essentially, a handful of large monopolistic corporations. And so I think, we're still kind of living with the after effects of this. You could more generously claim kind of ideological confusion, or you could also claim that it was a kind of vast project of deception, essentially to essentially reframe the selling off of this privately built, taxpayer funded communications platform, simply giving it away to private interests. And then claiming that is a matter of kind of handing it over to the people. And so it's very fascinating to me that, this, and again, in terms of the bipartisanship of this, Amit Mehta, who's the judge who decided this Google case, I won't go into was an Obama appointee, and is kind of, he actually prosecuted a number of the major January 6th rioters. So he was kind of a hero to many Democrats, and kind of seen as a important figure in liberal jurisprudence. But he really decided to lay off of Google and give it a kind of easy out from this set of charges.
In other news, the AI bubble is bursting. Geoff, do I have that right? That's the suggestion of the writer Ted Gioia in his Substack, The Honest Broker, which is excellent on so many topics. But Gioia sees AI and the way it's currently powering the U.S. stock market as another speculative frenzy. And I think his analysis is not so much based on a close reading of economic factors, though he does some of that. He talks about how the Magnificent Seven, these few companies that are powering our current increases in the market, are suggest a kind of narrowing of prosperity. There are a lot of other bad indicators in the economy, but the optimism around these companies is, for the moment, trumping all those other bad indicators. But what if the indications really aren't so good? And then this is really, it's an economic analysis in part, but underlying it is, I think, Joya's conclusion that the product produced by AI just isn't good. So it's basically it's an informed aesthetic judgment from a man who knows a great deal about art and human creation. He just thinks that what AI is putting out is so vastly inferior that we're not going to see great gains from it.
Okay, but the obvious parallel is the .com crash, right? You had all of these people saying, "Oh my gosh, this is the beginning of everything." It didn't mean that the .com, that the internet would not be the start of a new financial revolution. It absolutely was. It's just that people were running ahead of things and couldn't quite figure out how to monetize this. The famous example being that, what was it, dogs.com or something like that? They didn't have good supply chains. So there was no way really to get this dog food out to all these people. It took time, so I think it's silly to read this, as some people have, to mean that like AI itself is going to crash. And I think that the headline that was made was the MIT study that said that 95% of generative AI startups fail. But that's because they're promising everything. They're saying, you've got this task that you have to pay for right now. I'm going to have an AI for that. I'm going to have an AI for that. And, it's just not there yet. It's just not there yet. But it's only a matter of time. I think there's like a serious precarity within the financial market with all this money going into these big companies, and how much, how disastrous it's going to be when the revenue streams don't materialize, as they inevitably won't. But in terms of AI being the future, I think that's absolutely the case. And increased mechanization and robots, even though, Musk's, what was it, restaurant robot, failed miserably. But I think that's inevitable. All of that is the future. And it could be a really, really good future, but we just don't have the conditions for it at the moment.
Yeah, I find the sort of, I think Joya's outlook is, I find him an insightful person, and shared this piece with you all because I thought it was good. But I think it's somewhat typical of, I'd say, a kind of left liberal literary intelligentsia, which tends to be very dismissive. Tends to think, as I think I said in a Substack a few weeks ago, that it's both very bad and kind of dystopian. I mean, Joya had another piece that I thought was much weaker, that was like about why AI is evil or something like that, and it seemed quite silly to me. But that it's both kind of evil, but also kind of dumb and fake and pointless. So I think there is this kind of desperate effort to dismiss it, which is a little bit, I tend to find a bit tedious. My overall sense of it is, there are many of these things that as they emerged, it took a while for people to figure out, and I think, one thing I've read said that, we should really think of it mostly functioning as entertainment at the moment. Like, most of what people are using it for is just kind of messing around and, producing silly images and things like that. And that's certainly my own experience and that of various people I know. I found it kind of useful as the greatest kind of use case that I've found for it is just as a kind of search engine type function, especially with, I think, Google search having decayed and worsened. It seems to me, at this point, like the better chatbots are performing some of the functions I would have previously turned to Google for, and that's reasonably useful for certain things. But my overall sense is that people are still kind of messing around with these technologies and figuring out how they can use them. I do find frustrating that I think the sort of dismissiveness is, it seems to me very defensive. It's like this anxiety about, I don't know, essentially like people in creative disciplines fearing they're going to be replaced, which, I don't need to get into, but I mostly think that's kind of a silly concern, which, I mean, maybe I'm overly glib about this, but it's not something that keeps me up at night. But, but then the other thing that I think is very frustrating about the whole discourse is that the basic idea that, the main thing we should be concerned about is just this kind of apocalyptic, annihilation of the universe by malign AI, which, is something that's been promoted by people at the top of the industry and that they're all kind of obsessed with. It just seems like such a strange kind of diversionary tactic that I think many of them believe in, but it's kind of convenient for them to believe in it because it's, it sidelines a number of much more important kind of political questions about, essentially who owns and controls it, whose ends it serves, in a very immediate sense. So this whole fantasy that, it's just going to become totally autonomous and like turn the whole universe into paperclips. I mean, it's both silly, but it serves a sort of weird function of just getting us caught up in these ultimately, in my view, ludicrous sort of sci-fi scenarios so as to avoid discussing like actual political questions that exist around this today. So as far as the question of the bubble, I basically agree with Ashley. I think we're probably, it's gotten out ahead of itself. So we're probably at that phase of the cycle, but I don't dismiss it as something that's just going to disappear and prove totally irrelevant.
And also for all the sci-fi analogies, why does nobody bring up The Last Question, which is one of the greatest sci-fi stories ever, by Isaac Asimov? It's, think less HAL 9000, more Multivac or Galactic AC, where it is clearly the alienation of humans from ourselves. And this is the thing that people always say, like, oh, it's so terrible. It's like stolen everything from humans and it doesn't have all this human stuff. It isn't human in this way and da-da-da-da-da. I don't need it to be any of those things. We don't need it to be any of those things. That's the wonderful thing about alienation. Everyone, people take that Marxist critique of alienation like, oh, and that's bad. We're alienated. That's bad. No, we're alienated so that we become greater. Like the whole process of taking all of our production gets broken down so that it can come back together in this laptop. And I can produce things just like that. And all of humanity's art and genius gets all broken down and brought back together so that just like that, I can ask it a question. What is the solution to entropy? Which is the question, the last question in the Asimov story. It can be just us talking to our alienated selves, and that allows us to raise to a higher level. I feel like all of this dystopian nonsense is almost like permission for it to be used against humans, which is, what it is another possibility, obviously competing for jobs and making us obsolete and this sort of thing. And just another reason to talk about how shit humans are. We're just meat bags and all this junk. No, it doesn't have to be that way. It could be us raising ourselves to a higher level.
With that, thank you, Ashley. Thanks, Geoff. Thank you, listeners. To support our work and to get more, go to compactmag.com/subscribe.